What's up, everybody? Ron Sparkman here from Stardom, and today we're speaking with a very special guest, Chris Carberry, the Executive Director and co-founder of Explore Mars. Chris, how's it going?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, man, we're glad to have you. We're going to start off with a question that we like to ask all of our guests. Can you tell us where and when your interest in space and science began?
It's interesting. I don't have the traditional background for somebody in aerospace, the space community. Started off doing policy and history. Actually, my previous career was doing political history. I kind of meshed the two together, with the poli-sci and history degrees. And so I had always been interested in space exploration, but early on I didn't see how it'd have an impact on that when my background was history and policy. But then to date myself, back in the mid-90s, started reading up on things again and read a number of books, including Zubrin's Case for Mars and a number of other books, and realized that one of the biggest obstacles to moving forward in space exploration, specifically Mars, was political, not technical, whereas my skills would actually be particularly relevant to advancing the goals of space exploration. So I started volunteering early on, joined groups like the National Space Society originally, and then the Mars Society, and quickly took over political activity or policy activity for them. And it slowly transitioned into my full-time day job, and then in 2010, we founded Explore Mars, where I've been since.
And it's interesting you mentioned you're starting political science. I've started a couple years ago in college for astronomy, but strangely I've been drawn to history and political science. So I think that it's a very good thing that we have somebody like you that has that background in policy to help us move forward. We can certainly see that value in having someone like you on our team. And the need for that is somewhat new. Back around 2010, around the time that Explore Mars began, we started seeing an explosion in the interest of Mars again. So what do you think kicked that off? Where did that buzz come from?
It's a combination, and I can't define all of it. Some of it defies description. But yeah, you're right. You named a number of them, but I see it had started to build up around that time frame. I'm not going to claim all the credit, but yeah, we think we played a role. But I think, particularly when that lead up to the Curiosity lander, the successful landing. Meanwhile, you mentioned companies like SpaceX making a lot of impressive announcements and tip off their intention of going to Mars. And I think after that, I think people were already thinking about it. It was officially U.S. policy, kind of, sort of, at the time. And I think a lot of different things started to happen at once. And I think, we started bringing stakeholders together to see if people agreed that this was the goal. And frankly, even like in around 2012, 2013, even then, it wasn't the general consensus. You wouldn't have, prior to then, if you went to many of the major aerospace companies, SpaceX accepted, you wouldn't necessarily expect them to all agree that Mars was the goal. But we started sensing a shift. And because of curiosity, but there were other factors as well, which I can't quite define. And it just started really building up momentum between 2013, 2014. And then, as you mentioned, things like companies where like films and books like The Martian came out, NASA, the previous administration, and industry started becoming more and more interested in the topic. And frankly, it's not just in SpaceX, but other companies started coming out with interesting mission architecture concepts. I mean, last I heard there were about 8 fairly strong, efficient mission architecture concepts out there. And I think it really started going into popular culture more, obviously with The Martian, but there's not the only thing, National Geographic series, Mars, bunch of other things. You see it regularly in popular culture now where you never would have seen it years ago. I remember last year on the HBO series of Bill Maher, whatever they call it, he spent an entire segment, arguing against Mars,
Go to it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that as a sign of success, that, even 3 or 4 years ago, can you imagine any late night host spending so much of his show arguing against going to Mars? Why would they do that? But that was definitely a sign of success. But I think right now it still continues. There are so many different products out there, which we're going to highlight, and I'll talk about later when we're talking about our conference, the Humans to Mars Summit. But lots of VR projects, AR, AI, lots of countries doing things. We just came back from doing an event in Dubai, and the UAE is, just completely committed to Mars and Mars exploration, and other countries are doing robotic missions. So I think even though there may not be universal agreement on how and when we're going to go to Mars, I think there's just so much support, internationally, that we need to be, at least from a robotic perspective, and with the goal of getting there. Now we have to start building more uniformity, trying to figure out how we can get there. I know you wanted to ask me later if I thought SpaceX was going to beat NASA or the rest of the world. That's hard to say, and they might be doing it with NASA and the rest of the world. It really depends how it's structured, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see how things have transformed. Right now, of course, we have, with the change in administrations, there's a little bit of, questioning how much we're going to focus on the moon. And that's fine. The moon's been part of the equation for some time. It's just, what do you mean by we're refocusing on the moon? And that's a big question. If we're going to land on the moon, that's a big diversion. Not necessarily a bad one, but, from Mars advocates, it could, signify potentially decades delay in Mars. So how can we still keep the momentum for Mars and maybe accomplish some of these things around or on the moon with, international and commercial activities? So I think we're right now at a really critical moment. The momentum's still there for Mars and popular culture internationally, et cetera. But I think we're in a pretty good position. We just have to figure out where this is going and how we can make everybody happy within, it's impossible to make everybody happy, but find a way to accommodate, the various groups to adequately explore the moon, but then get on to Mars no later than the 2030s.
And you were just talking about the current administration, how much like the past administrations, they have a new mission that's refocusing on the moon. And we always seem to see this every time a new admin comes in. So are there positives of us going back to the moon again on the way to getting to Mars?
There can be, depending on who you talk to, people, different mission architectures will tell you different things on the value, at least the value for going to Mars. Mm-hmm. There are real value. There's real value. There are real benefits, to going to the moon. I'm not arguing that. I'd love to see us back on the moon. But as you're using that as an excuse to go to Mars, you can see value, to some degree, but whether it's, whether we can justify going to the surface of Mars to justify going, now I did it, the surface of the moon to Mars, you can argue that. And maybe we can, we haven't gone to another planetary body, obviously since we were on the moon. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not like, it's a different sort of landing since there's no atmosphere on the moon. But, there are other systems to practice and, propulsive landings, et cetera. So there's certainly benefits there. We want to test out life support, other systems. But, on the other end, there are a number of people who have been advocating, we need to build fuel depots on the moon before we can go to Mars. I'm not opposed to the concept of building fuel depots, but for waiting for those to be built before we go to Mars, I think we might be waiting many, many decades because there's so many big open questions on that. How much water, how accessible it is in the most complicated areas to reach, and and we don't even have from a number of the folks that I've talked to, NASA and former NASA, the places we would be sending even rovers, we don't have rovers that necessarily could operate in the temperatures, that we would be asking, astronauts to be operating in to actually reach that water and then extract it and then, turn it into a usable product, get it off the moon and somehow utilize it to go to Mars. I think as a long-term goal, this could be great if we could build up that infrastructure, but we wait for that before we go to Mars. I don't think we'll be going to Mars for a very long time.
No, that's perfect. That brings me to my next question. We have to be pragmatic about going to Mars, and we got to make sure that all of our ducks are in a row. So we still have a great deal of obstacles to overcome. So what are some of the problems we have to fix? We need to have a fix in place before we get to the red planet.
Well, I think this kind of part of this is the missions that are not there. Mm-hmm. There are two important missions that NASA has coming up. The InSight mission that's launching later this year, actually right before the Humans to Mars Summit in May. And then the 2020 rover, which is basically based on the same architecture that the Curiosity rover was built on. And that has some interesting stuff, additional science, but it's also going to be testing some initial ISRU technology with the MOXIE mission, and that's great. But that's the last mission that NASA has on its agenda, on its docket for Mars, despite the fact it's been one of the most, if not the most successful science program. One can argue which one, but that's certainly one of the top two, if not the top one. To actually not schedule anything beyond that is unfortunate. And I think one of the reasons is, I think all the success and the support for sending humans to Mars is actually inadvertently undercut some of the science missions. And I think we need to explain to people that shouldn't be the case, because the missions that will be in the 2020s are some of the most important missions, precursor missions for sending humans. For instance, there has been on the schedule, I don't think may not actually happen anymore because it hasn't gotten really any money, that's 2022 Reconnaissance Resource Orbiter. That's another mission that they want to send, to actually look for resources, the resources that we've used if we were living off the land on Mars. They also have been talking forever about a sample return mission. And so I think there's a lot of growing international support for that. Some people argue against it, say we should just send humans directly to Mars. But, I see that as a great way. It has real value to bring back samples, test it out, etc. But it also has a way, it might have the ability to help unify more international support. We're big advocates for international collaboration going to Mars. So there's a lot of international interest in it right now. And if we can combine that with some of the real precursor human missions, meaning like for letting humans, like a heavy sample return, that could have real value. Since right now, as you know, we've only landed we've landed is the Curiosity rover, about 1 metric ton. Mm-hmm. We'll need to send between 20 and 40-ish, with people at minimum. Now, a sample return won't be that heavy, but it might be that intermediate phase. If we do a heavy sample return, test out something, maybe even a half scale, 10 metric tons, 5 metric tons, test out that technology of landing that through the Martian atmosphere. Then utilize that by testing out ISRU, do a sample return, and then ascent technology. That could have some real value. Advancing the science goals, and that science goal is part of the #1 item on the Science Decadal Survey, and just test out vital things like EDL.
And we talk about NASA, and obviously there's the great deal of the government agencies that are working very hard. You mentioned UAE earlier, Space Symposium in the last few years, putting everybody on stage. Everybody has been talking about Mars. It's been a massive thing. We've got that coming up here next month, and it's going to be exciting. I always love going to it. But one of the big things is always the private space agencies that are showing up, and they are really starting to show up. Now they're even showing up at events like SXSW. Elon was just there, and he's talking.
I know, I saw that.
The possible short missions. Well, first he decided to dive in on a random one like the Westworld one, which was completely crazy. And then, of course, he had his own talk, and he's talking about these short trips with BFR possibly next year, which is kind of surprising considering the fact that Falcon Heavy, even to him, was a bit of a surprise that it had such success. So then he's talking about, sending the first cargo missions in 2022. These are some crazy timelines, and he's kind of known for that. But are these timelines that he can keep up with, and what could they mean for us moving closer to Mars?
Obviously, and we've always been big supporters of SpaceX. We wish them well. We, of course, would love it if they were able to succeed, succeed in these goals and these timelines. And so, but unless maybe they have a lot of things we haven't seen going on, with the BFR, it seems like a really ambitious timeline to actually be testing it next year. I hope they are. This would be great. I hope, I'm always saying that I hope I'm like that guy who, like, when the New York Times, said that, like right before the Wright brothers flew, we probably won't fly for another 1,000 years. I hope I'm that guy by saying, I think it's a little ambitious to get, be testing it next year. And I also think it's probably, a little optimistic saying we're going to start those missions in the early 2020s. But it's not at all being critical of SpaceX. It's just, I think Elon is wonderful with these ambitious goals. He's managed to accomplish a tremendous amount, but even the Falcon Heavy, it was way behind when he said he wanted to launch it originally. That's not a criticism, but it was challenging. I believe, and I may be wrong, I believe he originally wanted to launch it in 2012. Mm-hmm. And so, it was a number of years behind. That's fine. It was a new technology, a new rocket. And so I don't expect this current timeline to actually occur when he says it was, but if he can continually push away and, hit off some of the milestones along the way, who knows what will happen. But I also hope that they will consider, if we can find the right balance between the more traditional approach and this entrepreneurial approach, and bring people together so we can finally make some forward motion. Mm-hmm. Because one of the problems with, one of the things I see as a problem with, at least SpaceX approach, I'm not going to comment on architecture, I'm not an architecture guy, but is the funding. And Elon's also mentioned she's not 100% sure how it's going to be funded. And so I've, mentioned a number of times, if he's expecting it to be entirely through government funding, at least earmarked for Mars, saying Congress and the administration decides we're going to just spend all the money on SpaceX, even if it's a lot cheaper. I don't see that happening just because the way things, political reality. True. There's just so much strong support, around the country for other systems or other companies as well. And so I've always found, people like got attacked the other, last week for writing an article, mentioning things like that. But I think we also have to find a way to, balance, technical reality and political reality. But on the other end, if you can find a funding mechanism and can achieve it independently, that's great. And, we're obviously in support of that. We want to get to Mars as quickly as possible. If we can get humans on Mars on his timeline by the mid-2020s, that's terrific. But I wouldn't wager a lot of money we're going to hit that timeline. But I would wager money that he's going to help motivate activity and move some important technologies forward. But as I said, hopefully we can find that balance particularly if it's through government funding, to bring all the players together to find the most efficient, that balance between efficiency and political reality, which isn't always the same thing.
And that's an excellent segue into our discussion on what you've been up to with Explore Mars. What we just talked about is just one piece of what it is that your organization is working on. So can you tell our audience a little bit about your organization, how it developed, and how people can be involved?
Well, this actually is quite relevant. We just released last year our the fourth report of our Mars Achievability workshops, Mars Achievability and Sustainability workshops. We've been doing them since 2013. Each year, kind of take a little bit, move it a little forward. The original one, as I mentioned back in 2013, I kind of alluded to the discussions, but didn't mention what it was. After our first Humans to Mars summit in 2013, we'd seen this, saw what looked to be a growing consensus for Mars. And at that point, we decided we needed to have some workshops to bring community together, determine first off, do we agree that it's Mars? Do we agree that Mars is the goal? Second, is it achievable? And the third one is, can we do it affordably? Mm-hmm. And of course, the last one was going to be the most complicated, but we didn't even know that we were going to get the first one. Do we agree that Mars is the goal? We were quite happy when all the different players, and this was most of the big aerospace companies, NASA and some internationals, and some commercial as well. I mean, the big aerospace companies are commercial, so they hate it when people differentiate them from commercial. But regardless, there was agreement on that. Took a little longer to make people agree, and there were a number of very conservative folks in this group that could be achievable. And of course, it was most challenging to get them to agree it could be affordable. But by the end, they all agreed. They said, of course, we couldn't do it the same way as we've been doing it, but it can be all those things. So fast forward to the last one, there are two of them ago, back in December of 2016, we looked at tall poles or long pole technologies that we need to develop now that take a long time to develop, that we know are critical for going to Mars, but may take a number of years to develop. We can't just all of a sudden get to low Martian orbit and realize, oh, now we need to start developing this. The biggest one, as I mentioned earlier with talking about science missions, was EDL. Most of the architecture experts that we've talked to agree that the entry, descent, and landing is the biggest long pole, the most challenging thing. They're pretty sure they can get it done. They just need a number of years to get it done. We can't just say, once again, as I mentioned, plan an orbital mission and then say, now we're going to start working on the lander, because if we did that, it might be another 12, 15 years. Yeah. So we need to start working on that now. Things like ECLIS, life support and environmental systems. We obviously have a lot of experience on the space station, but they're able, to resupply fixed parts. They have, new parts from Earth. We haven't tested out a system that has to go the distance to Mars without having, the ability to call home and fix things with resupply missions. There are a lot of great ideas out there. Some people say this is not a big challenge. Some people say it's an enormous one, but we have to address it. I think, like with everything, there's a big spectrum in between, what people say, like Robert Zubrin on one side and some, other folks on the other, but it's probably somewhere in between. So.
Yeah. And talking about what you've been up to actually leads us to my next question, which is about Explore Mars. That's only one piece of it. You guys are trying to answer these questions and a great deal more. Can you tell our audience a little bit about your organization, how it developed, and then how people can be involved in it, because you guys are very much about including as many people as possible.
Yeah, we founded Explore Mars back in 2010. It was shortly after I left. I had been executive director of the Mars Society for a little while, and a number of folks from that group and some others decided we wanted to create a group that was not a membership group. We did not want to compete with groups like NSS, the Mars Society, Planetary Society, the membership advocacy groups. First off, we didn't think there was a need for another membership group. There were already plenty of them. And we didn't want to have to compete with them in that way. It just was not in our best interest. It was not in their best interest. We really weren't trying to, take, followers from any of these groups. But what we wanted to do is start really focusing in on particular issues and technologies and find a different way to start advocating for Mars. And we started off, and this was controversial at the beginning, our first conference ended up being the ISS and Mars conference. And interestingly, this came out of a big argument with our board, obviously within the Mars community, International Space Station's always been quite controversial. And a lot of people in the community have said, we shouldn't have built it. We could have gone straight to Mars. We should dump it in the ocean, blah, 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 blah. And that may or may not be true, but but it's there. We built it, so we can't go back in time and unbuild it. And so during our board meeting, that same argument came up, and one of our board members at the time mentioned we should make a statement that ISS should be dumped into the ocean. And at this point, of course, we were looking for we were pursuing sponsors and others, particularly ones who actually built ISS, and we thought that might not endear us to new funding sources. Not that that's the only thing, but we were also trying to find a way to bring people together. And so out of that, the idea came up of maybe we should have a conference to talk about, can ISS be utilized, how can it be utilized for getting to Mars? And so that became our first conference, but also became a model for how we operated, bringing communities together. It was perfectly timed, actually, because it's when, we realize a lot of people working at NASA, working for ISS, but also, at that point, I think right at that time, 2 mission directorates are turned into one for human spaceflight. You had the operations and human spaceflight. They were merged. And, we realized the ISS community really were enthusiastic about Mars and wanted to find a way. But then on the other side, you had the Mars community who was skeptical and suspicious of ISS. So it took a lot of effort, and I had to pull a lot of people from the Mars community in kicking and screaming. But by the end, there were so many connections made, and a lot of people who were skeptical at the beginning, or literally I had to argue with for 3 hours to convince them, were sold on it. Not that we want to keep ISS forever, but let's utilize this facility to help advance the Mars goal. But what that did was start a process and kind of allowed us to do one of the things we do best. As I mentioned, we bring groups together, we build partnerships, and I think we work well with others and try to respect other people's viewpoints. Sometimes others kind of criticize us because, oh, well, you're selling out to this group. No, we're trying to bring people together. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, and I think we've done that moving forward and build up a lot of partnerships and build up a lot of, continuous sponsors and partners along over the number of years. And I think that's been one of the things we've done best. And so in 2013, we launched our first Humans to Mars Summit. It's grown each year, and right now it is the largest conference in the world focused on sending humans to Mars.
And we'll actually get to that in just one second. But to make a point, it's one of the reasons that, our group with I Love Mars, love working with you guys, had a great time last year. And it is certainly a different atmosphere and a different feel than the rest of them. I've been, Space Symposium, Mars Society Convention a number of times, and it just has a different feel to it. And it's what you put together is definitely moving us forward in a different way. And one of those ways, before we actually get to the summit itself, is policy. It's something that obviously you have a big background in, and it's something that's separate. You hear it talked about, but you guys are actually trying to move the policy forward. You go to events, you present to Congress. So can you tell us a little bit about what you guys are working on in that area and what you're doing to move Mars exploration forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been always a key part, trying to find a way to reach out, educate members of Congress. And I think it's primarily, it's not like lobbying per se, it's really just trying to explain what is there, that these things are possible. I think this has been the biggest issue. And this is where another big transformation I forgot to mention before. I'm probably leaping ahead here, but I'll kind of back up to, at least our role in changing that. Mm-hmm. When I started talking to members of Congress about Mars exploration, and once again, that was back in the mid to late 90s, you'd go into a congressional office and, they would roll their eyes, when you said, oh, we should go to Mars, they would look at you as though you're wearing Vulcan ears, they would, it was definitely not, they would not.
You were?
Oh, did you see that old picture?
Maybe.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, but yeah, we didn't, there was a big giggle factor. Most people did not take this seriously. And at the time, Mars exploration wasn't even allowed to really be talked about at NASA. It was in the tail end of the Clinton administration. Yeah, the Clinton administration. And so at that point, they weren't actually allowed to even talk about Mars, humans to Mars, to imply that there was some big program that NASA wanted to do. But that just transformed over time, throughout through the early 2000s, of course, as, vision for space exploration, Moon, Mars, and beyond came and went. And then through the next administration, things developed over time. And so right now, through all that, we see very little outward criticism or skepticism and very few rolled eyes. Everybody assumes in Congress, maybe not everybody, but the vast majority of people we talk to assume we're going to Mars. They might have different agreements on how much we should fund it, but we've gone from, I won't quite say that they thought we were nuts, but something like that to, everybody just assuming this is our, goal. The United States is planning to go to Mars. And so that was quite a dramatic change. I mean, that was a number of years, but, having seen that over a couple decades, it was quite a dramatic change. Does that mean we're any closer to Mars? I don't know, but
Yeah.
At least it's a little easier, I think, when we have so much support than back when people didn't think it was possible. And so that was a long-winded way to set up kind of the answer. One of the things we do, like with our Humans to Mars report each year, which we deliver to every member of Congress and to stakeholders, one of the problems we saw a number of years back was it wasn't just Congress. It was even the space community, aerospace companies that didn't necessarily know what was going on within the space community for mission architectures and things like that. We saw people representing, major figures in large aerospace companies who weren't aware of the most recent thinking of human missions to Mars, who thought it would still thought it was going to cost $1 trillion, which is nuts, and weren't even aware of some of the things their own companies were doing. That some really innovative thoughts, more efficient mission architecture, or updates in science or policy, level of support. So we created the Humans to Mars report, which is an annual snapshot report of updates in mission architecture, science, policy, public perception, and other items, to make sure that policymakers and the space community itself knows what's going on. So there's no excuse to be completely unaware, within your own community, what is going on, what's possible. And I think that's made a difference to show this is realistic. Even separate from, what SpaceX or other companies are announcing, to show that even without that, there are a lot of viable plans to do it, in a reasonable time frame and without doubling or 50% increase in NASA's budget.
And what you're discussing right now is always a main topic at the Humans to Mars Summit, which we've touched on a little bit, but let's go into a little bit more detail. What is it about the Humans to Mars Summit that makes it special? What's it bringing to the table that the other ones have not? And what can people kind of expect for the event that's coming up May 8th to the 10th this year?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think it is different. I think we have a lot of diversity. We keep it focused. We format it differently, and this is where some people criticize it. Some people in a. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. We focus more on topic than we do on speakers. We always have great speakers, but some conferences focus on what big speakers can we get. And that's great. You want that, but we usually start off, what topics do we want to cover? And then, well, I wouldn't call it backfill it with speakers. That sounds insulting to the speakers, but we try to find the right speakers for those topics. And sometimes we try not, we also don't like, occasionally we'll highlight one specific company or architecture, but we don't like doing that also, which sometimes agitates some companies, but we try not to. We try to highlight everybody equally, but that's not why it's special, but it kind of differentiates itself from others. We also try to reach out beyond, other conferences do it, but I think we do a particularly good job at reaching out beyond the usual suspects. For instance, this year we have a day that's focusing on like different types of technology, like virtual reality and AR and AI, social media. We're going to be really bringing in new players to talk about that, trying to bring in folks that are not associated with space exploration. There's a lot of stuff going on. We're trying to also integrate STEM much more. We always have a lot of great STEM stuff, but we're trying to integrate students and young professionals in all the main panels as well. So it's not just, once again, a group of the usual people that are important, they're vital, but we want to show, there's a lot of thought that young professionals are really working on this and students are really active in this as well. And so I think we just do a particularly good job. I probably didn't answer the question very well, but we've just found a way to find that right balance, I think, to, once again, so it's not combine, well, maybe this is the way it defines best. It combines, people say, some people complain that it's not one thing or another. And, you have to decide, is this a professional conference or is this an advocacy conference? Say, why do I need to decide? It's intentionally schizophrenic.
Yeah,
that was,
no reason to that I can.
It's schizophrenic by design. We want, it's a good thing from my perspective to have the aerospace professionals there that you see at professional conferences, which they are every year. And we have, top level technical talks, but also have the advocacy groups and other groups and that's what we're supposed to do, bring things together, because you always hear other people say, oh, it's always the same people in an echo chamber. But then some people complain, oh, it's too diverse. You have to decide which you want to do. No, we want to bring them together. That's a good thing. And that helps building ideas, bringing new ideas, that the same group may not have thought of, or that the new groups may realize, oh, we have opportunities that we weren't aware of. Like, for instance, we just had a workshop on VR and AR, just bringing together mission architecture people and science people along with VR experts to see if we can start stimulating ideas between the two communities, and we're continuing that with the conference. So there's a lot going on. I think we try to really push that each year to kind of force people together.
And I think that's a great thing, because it allows people like me who are based in the digital world, the social media world, to be able to connect with these people. And sometimes when they have the intellect that they have, they aren't the best at being science communicators, which allows people like myself and Bill and the other people, Astronaut Abby, those kind of people, to come in, absorb that information, and then dole it back out to the public and the regular people that can connect with it, and saying, hey, here's a regular guy talking about it. I can pick up something from there. And I think that's a great mix of it. And I think it's something that we should, that I think everybody should focus more on. And another major thing that you mentioned is STEM advocacy. I'm really big on all ages STEM advocacy. I think, the adults learning more is better, because they are the voting elite, I guess you would say. So we want to get the average people out there a little bit more, but you guys focus a lot on kids and inspiring what a lot of people refer to as the Mars generation, the next generation. So what is it that you guys are doing to promote STEM? And can you tell us a little bit about what you guys have coming up that can connect the children a little bit more to Mars and finally going?
Yeah, now we have a lot of things going on. And one thing, we're partnering with the Challenger Center again. Challenger is going to be doing some side programming at H2M, with really cool activities, to really inspire the students they bring in, from the DC area. And then they'll bring them into the conference itself, or some of the appropriate sessions on the first day. Janet Ivey from Janet's Planet will also be there doing some sessions and doing her great stuff. So that's going on. We're going to be announcing some STEM activities coming up also. But as I mentioned, because we have some interesting programs coming up that we want to announce, but which we hope to be ready to announce at H2M as well. And so, but on stage, we'll have, of course, a session with students interviewing. Currently, Astronaut Abby is scheduled to interview them. We're trying to see, she may not be able to be there that day, so we're trying to figure out if we can shift that or not. Regardless, either her or somebody else will be moderating a panel of younger students and early professional students also. And then we'll also have, as I mentioned, we have some young, students and young professionals on panels like social media one, on an economics and space panel we're also having a student moderate a congressional panel. We have the opening session at H2M will be a congressional panel. We're lining up some members, but right now Congressman Perlmutter is committed to come. And so we're hoping to have 2 or 3 members of Congress there and have a student moderate that panel, which I think will be unusual. I think it'll be cool. It'll be a little bit different than your usual policy congressional panel.
I love that. And so are there any words of advice that you have for anybody that's out there that can't wait to go to Mars? It doesn't matter, kids of all ages that want to maybe go themselves, or just interested in being a part of it. What are your words of wisdom to them?
Well, there's so many ways to engage now. I mean, just view the Humans to Mars Summit, view other things. There are always opportunities you can see while watching them, groups that you can reach out to and play a role. Like for instance, we had a group of students that went up to Capitol Hill with us for the Space Exploration Alliance legislative blitz a few weeks ago. And members of Congress love it when students come to visit, particularly from their home districts. They'll almost always come out themselves as opposed to just a staff member. Something wrong with the staff, but they love it when students come to the Hill. And so there are so many ways of engaging, with the Challenger Center, as I mentioned, have some wonderful Mars programs they can engage with. There are various other, we're in a membership group. We have things they can do, like come to our conference and help with various things, but there are lots of membership groups that, have special student programs as well. So there are a lot of things that they can do. But I think just viewing the conference, viewing other, events going on, I think they can see different opportunities that they can be involved in. It's no longer the age where students can no longer have an impact on the space program. This is a place where, it's much more democratized, so many more opportunities. And it's not just Mars, of course. Who would have thought 20 or 30 years ago that, middle school students would be able to have their own little space program, sending CubeSats into space? Mm-hmm. It's a vastly different world than we used to live in. And so it's very exciting. And who knows in the next 20 years what students will be able to be doing.
And I think that's fascinating that we're getting so many different people involved now, and it's of all ages. And, even so, I was in my English Comp 2 class last semester, and a bunch of people wanted to write about Mars. It's everybody of all ages that are excited about it again, and it's one of those things that we're very excited to see. And so we have one more question. We've got one from our Patreon, and this is a Patreon question from Renee Douglas, and this is a little sciencey, so hopefully it's not a little too crazy for us to answer here. But
well, we'll see.
We'll see. This was kind of a last minute addition. She sent it to me a little bit ago. So like I said, it's very sciencey. So she was saying, Mars was habitable long ago, even long before Earth, because of everything that Earth went through. If an advanced civilization could have had the time to develop on Mars as it did here, skyscrapers and all, how long would it have taken for Mars' atmosphere to deteriorate everything into the nothing we see on the red planet today?
Yeah, I have no idea. It's like, I apologize. I'm going to punt that question. It's obviously Mars is a smaller planet, smaller gravity, it's so lots of variables, but, I think it's impossible to hypothesize how long it would take if there had been a intelligent civilization, which is no evidence there was, of course, hypothetically speaking, yeah. I have no idea. I mean, and I don't even know if, I'm a policy guy, so I have an excuse, but I don't know even, it's a good question. I've never heard it phrased quite that way before, but it would be interesting to find that out. I mean, I don't even know if the Mars science experts that I know would be able to answer that one question, but it's interesting, and it would take certainly a shorter time, I suspect, than Earth, just because of different factors. But I really don't know. So sorry.
I will try and crash a Q&A. I'll pull a buzz and I'll try and hit a Q&A and see if I can ask somebody during the Humans to Mars Summit. So just really quick, can you tell us where people can find you, where they can register for Humans to Mars, and where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, no. Absolutely. For Humans to Mars, just go to h2m.exploremars.org. You can see we'll be making many updates over the next week or two with new speakers and filling out the agenda. Agenda's coming together well, but you'll see there's still a number of holes in it. But we'll be plugging those holes very well over the next 2 weeks. And so you go to h2m.exploremars, or just looking for Explore Mars in general, as you can probably imagine, it's just exploremars.org. As for social media, of course, we're all over social media. So, just search for Facebook or Twitter. You'll find the Explore Mars accounts and other social media accounts as well. But I know those ones, particularly Twitter and Facebook, are particularly active. And so I'm not the social media guy, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But you can find us all there. We'd love for you to connect with us.
Fantastic, Chris. Thank you so much for your time today, and let us pick that big brain of yours. And we can't wait to see you in May at the Human.
I don't know how big it is, but
Well, we can't wait to see you in May. We will certainly be there.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And to everybody else, thank you so much. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you guys on the next episode.